The election was supposed to be a turning point, a step toward justice, but instead, it shattered everything. As hatred and division spread through their town like wildfire, Lucia and Julian found themselves caught between love and a world that refused to accept them. Now, with everything at stake, they must decide: will they fight for their future, or become another casualty of a system designed to tear them apart? The sun was setting over Wisconsin's rolling hills, casting long shadows across the patchwork fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The evening air held a chill, the kind that whispered of the coming winter, but there was warmth in the small town of Greenfield where Lucia, a young Latina woman with dark, curly hair and eyes that seemed to hold the mysteries of forgotten ancestors, stood by a modest house, staring at the distant skyline of Milwaukee. Her heart beat with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation, for today was the day that history would be written, and her life, tangled in the roots of a country she loved and feared, would be forever altered. In just a few hours, the results of the 2025 Wisconsin Supreme Court election would be announced, and Lucia knew that her future, the future of the people she cared about, rested on the fragile balance of a single vote. She had spent months knocking on doors, educating voters, trying to bridge the divide between the communities that had been torn apart by years of division and fear, but she wasn't sure if it would be enough. She thought of her father, whose hands were calloused from years of hard work, and her mother, whose quiet strength had always been a comforting presence. They had taught her to never give up on hope, but Lucia had seen the way the world was changing. The air had shifted over the past few years, turning colder, more hostile. The whispers of racial tension and injustice had become louder, and she could feel the weight of it pressing on her chest. It was in the way people looked at her when they saw her dark skin, her heritage, her accent. It was in the way she had to prove herself every single day. As the results of the election hung in the balance, so too did the delicate, forbidden love she shared with Julian, a man whose skin was pale, his features so different from her own, yet whose soul had intertwined with hers in a way neither could explain. They had met in college, during the protests that had erupted after the death of another young black man at the hands of a police officer, and from the first moment their eyes had locked, there was no denying the connection that had sparked between them. But their love was not without its trials. Wisconsin had always been a battleground for racial justice, a place where lines were drawn in the sand, and every election felt like the last stand for those who had been marginalized. Lucia had always known that her love for Julian could never be simple. He came from a family that had supported the candidates, who had stoked fear and hatred, a family that had never understood why she fought so hard for what they called special treatment. He had grown up in a world where whiteness was the norm, where privilege was a quiet companion in every step he took, while Lucia had to fight for every inch she gained, constantly reminding herself that the world would never see her as equal, not with her heritage, her name, her skin. Yet, their love had blossomed despite the world that tried to tear them apart, blooming in secret, hidden beneath the shadows of disapproving glances and hushed whispers. Every stolen moment was a gift, a precious fragment of light in a world that seemed to grow darker with each passing day. Lucia had never told her parents about Julian, not because she was ashamed, but because she feared their disapproval. She feared what their rejection might do to the fragile bond they had created over the years. They had always warned her about the dangers of loving someone from a different world, someone who would never truly understand the struggle of their people. But Lucia had believed that love, real love, was not bound by the divisions of race or culture. She had believed that, like the election results, change was possible, that one day people would see beyond the color of their skin, and they would simply see each other. But as the days grew closer to the election, Lucia had seen the way the rhetoric had shifted. The air had become thick with fear, with promises of division and supremacy. The country, the state, her community seemed to be falling apart at the seams, and no matter how hard she fought, no matter how many doors she knocked on, the results were slipping out of reach. And with them, so too was her dream of a future with Julian, of a world where their love could thrive without fear. The election results would either bring justice and hope, or they would seal the fate of her people, entrenching them in a cycle of systemic oppression that seemed impossible to break. She had heard the whispers about the candidate who was backed by the far right, the one who had promised to dismantle civil rights protections, who had called for the restoration of a world that Lucia had never known, a world where people like her had no place, no voice. She had seen the fear in Julian's eyes when he spoke of the election, the way he struggled with his own place in a country that seemed to demand loyalty to one side or the other. She knew that he was torn, that the values his family had instilled in him were in conflict with the love he felt for her, a love that could never be fully understood by those who did not walk in her shoes. The day of the election, the streets were filled with a quiet tension, a stillness that spoke volumes. Lucia stood in line at her polling place, her hand trembling as she filled out her ballot, knowing that every vote counted, knowing that the future of her community, her country, was in her hands. Behind her, a young man of color, no older than 20, held his ballot with a look of resolve in his eyes. He was a stranger, but in that moment, he was a brother, a symbol of the collective strength that had always defined their people. Lucia pressed the ink pen into the paper, marking her vote with the weight of generations behind her. The day passed slowly, the hours dragging as she waited for the results, feeling the weight of the world pressing against her chest. Julian had promised to meet her later that night, but she wasn't sure if he would show. Their love had always been fragile, held together by the threads of hope and trust, but as the results began to trickle in, it felt as though even those threads were beginning to unravel. When the numbers were finally announced, Lucia's heart sank. The candidate backed by the far right had won, and the country, it seemed, had chosen fear over hope. The streets erupted in protest, but there was no joy in it, no celebration. Only the hollow sound of people crying out for justice, for change that seemed further away than ever. Lucia stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes searching for Julian, but she couldn't find him. The faces of the people around her blurred, the sounds of their voices drowned out by the roar in her ears. She turned, walking away from the chaos, hoping that somewhere Julian was waiting for her, but knowing in her heart that the distance between them had grown too great. The night was cold, and the stars seemed distant, as if even the universe had turned its back on them. Lucia thought of her father, her mother, her community, and wondered how much longer they could keep fighting, how much longer they could hold on to hope in a world that was slipping away. And then, in the stillness of the night, she saw him. Julian stood at the end of the street, his face pale, his eyes searching for her. He stepped forward, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. There was no need for words, for they both knew the weight of the world they carried, the burden of love in a time of division. She ran to him, and as their hands touched, there was a brief, fragile moment where everything seemed right in the world. But it was only a moment, a fleeting moment, and as the noise of the world came rushing back, so too did the realization that their love, as beautiful as it was, could not escape the forces that sought to tear them apart. And so they stood, in the quiet of the night, knowing that their love would never be enough to erase the hate that had seeped into the fabric of their country. As the night deepened, Lucia and Julian stood frozen in that single, fragile moment, their hands clasped as if to anchor them to a world that no longer seemed to belong to them. The shadows of the street stretched long and hollow around them, the streetlights flickering like the dying embers of a forgotten fire. Lucia could hear the distant wail of sirens, the shrill voices of protesters spilling into the night air, their anger and frustration rising in a tidal wave of emotion that seemed to drown out the rest of the world. The winds had picked up, sweeping across the empty streets, sending the fallen leaves into spirals, swirling them like forgotten memories caught in the current. Her heart beat in rhythm with the distant chants, the calls for justice that now felt more like desperate cries in the dark than the hopeful rallying cries of a nation poised for change. Julian stood beside her, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as if he, too, were struggling to breathe in a world that had become too heavy. His eyes, pale and wide, reflected a kind of disbelief, as if the enormity of what had just transpired hadn't fully sunk in yet. He squeezed her hand, a silent offering of solidarity, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made her wonder if he was seeing her for the first time, or if he was seeing what they both had always known, but had been too afraid to acknowledge. She wanted to speak, to tell him everything that had been tumbling in her heart since the election results had come through, but the words felt too much for the moment, too heavy to say aloud. Instead, they stood together in silence, the hum of the city around them like an uninvited guest at their private grief. For Lucia, the pain was not just in the election results, it was in the realization that the country she had fought for, the country she had hoped would one day be the land of opportunity and equality that her parents had dreamt of, had chosen division over unity, fear over love. It was in the way her own people had been silenced once again, their voices drowned out by those who saw them as nothing more than a threat, a stain on the fabric of a nation that claimed to stand for freedom and justice. And it was in the way she now saw Julian, the man she loved with every fiber of her being, torn between the world he had grown up in and the love that had taken root in his heart for her. She had never asked him to choose between her and his family, but the choices were being forced upon him in ways neither of them could have predicted. Julian looked over at her, his expression softening, as if he could feel the weight of her thoughts, her internal struggle. "Lucia," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how we got here. How everything went so wrong." She turned to face him fully, studying his face as though searching for some kind of answer, some glimmer of the hope that had once burned between them so brightly. But all she saw was confusion, sorrow, and the faintest flicker of fear. She could no longer deny it. The cracks in their relationship, in their love, had widened in ways that neither of them had been prepared for. They had always known that their love was an act of defiance, a quiet rebellion against the world that sought to keep them apart, but they had never anticipated that the world would rise up against them with such fury, such unrelenting force. The division was no longer something abstract, something that could be ignored or downplayed. It had become real, tangible, and it was strangling them, choking the life out of what they had once shared. "I know," she said softly, her voice trembling as she fought back the tears that threatened to betray her. "I don't know how we got here, either. It feels like the ground beneath us is shifting, like the whole world is slipping away, and there's nothing we can do to stop it." Julian reached for her, pulling her into his arms, his warmth a fleeting comfort against the cold that had settled deep inside her. She buried her face against his chest, inhaling the familiar scent of him, but even that felt different now, like a memory she was losing. He stroked her hair gently, his hand trembling slightly, and she could feel the tension in his body, the fear that had settled in his bones. "I wish I could protect you from all of this," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I wish I could make it stop, make everything go back to the way it was before, when it felt like we could dream of something better. But I don't know if I can anymore." The words hit her like a slap, and for a moment, she was frozen, caught between the love she had always known and the harsh reality that was unfolding around them. She wanted to scream, to rail against the injustice of it all, to demand answers from a world that had failed them both. But instead, she simply closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against his, and let the tears fall, silent and steady, as the world raged on around them. She knew that the fight wasn't over, that the struggle for justice, for equality, would continue, even in the face of defeat. But in that moment, with Julian's arms around her and the cold winds biting at their skin, it felt like everything had been lost. The future they had once envisioned together seemed like a distant dream, something that had never truly belonged to them. She couldn't help but wonder if their love had ever stood a chance in a world that was so determined to keep them apart. And yet, as the minutes stretched into hours, and the protests outside began to quiet, Lucia found herself wondering if there was still hope. If the love they shared, fragile and flawed as it was, could somehow survive the wounds that had been inflicted upon it. Could love, real love, withstand the weight of a nation's hatred? Could it defy the divisions that had been drawn in the sand? Or had they been doomed from the start, doomed to be torn apart by the forces of a world that could never see them for what they truly were. Two souls, bound by the purest of emotions, struggling to survive in a landscape that was too broken to understand. Julian's grip tightened around her, as if sensing her thoughts, and she looked up into his face, searching for something, anything, that might give her a glimpse of the man she had once known, the man who had held her heart in his hands with a tenderness that seemed almost impossible in the face of everything they had endured. But what she saw was not the certainty she had hoped for. What she saw was a man who was just as lost as she was, just as unsure of the path ahead. The uncertainty between them stretched out, as vast and unforgiving as the dark sky above them. The love they had shared, the hope they had once clung to, seemed so small now, like a fragile thread that had been stretched too thin. They both knew that they could not escape the consequences of the election, the consequences of the world that had turned its back on them. And yet, there was still a part of her, a stubborn, defiant part, that refused to give up on the possibility of change. Maybe it wasn't in the election results. Maybe it wasn't in the country that had chosen to tear itself apart. But maybe, just maybe, change could still come from within. Perhaps their love, even in its brokenness, could still be a force for something greater, something that transcended the hate and fear that had poisoned the world around them. As she looked up at Julian once more, their eyes meeting in the dim light of the street, she knew that their love was not over. Not yet. The night grew colder still, the wind biting at their skin, and the world around them felt vast and empty, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Lucia didn't know how long they had stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, suspended in that fragile moment of shared despair and unspoken understanding. It felt as if time had stopped, the outside world fading away, leaving only the two of them, standing on the precipice of something both beautiful and terrifying. The sounds of the city had softened, but the distant protests still lingered, the voices of the disillusioned rising and falling like the ebb and flow of a storm. She could feel the weight of it all pressing on her chest, the helplessness that seemed to tighten its grip with every passing second. She wanted to tell Julian that they could fight, that they could make it through this, that love could still conquer all the hate that surrounded them, but the words wouldn't come. What was there to say? How could she make him understand the depth of the sorrow that had settled in her heart, the way she had watched the world unravel, one lie at a time? She had always believed in the possibility of change, in the idea that love could break through the barriers of fear and prejudice. But now, as she stood there in Julian's arms, she wondered if it had all been a lie, a fantasy she had clung to in the hope of something better. The reality of the election results was a bitter pill to swallow, and no matter how much she tried to push it away, the truth gnawed at her. The country had made its choice, and it wasn't one of unity, of justice. It was a choice rooted in division, in fear, in the ugly history that continued to cast its shadow over every corner of their lives. But even in the midst of that crushing despair, something inside her stirred, something that whispered that all was not lost, that the fight wasn't over, that they could still find a way to make a difference. She felt Julian's hand against her back, his fingers splayed wide, as if he were trying to hold her together, trying to hold himself together. She could hear the way his breath hitched in his chest, the slight tremble in his voice when he spoke again, his words thick with emotion. "Lucia, I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm suffocating. Everything is falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if I can even fix us." His voice cracked on the last word, and Lucia felt her heart break in ways she hadn't known were possible. She looked up at him, her eyes searching for something, anything, that might offer a sliver of hope, but she saw only fear. Fear in the way his shoulders slumped, fear in the way his lips trembled. And yet, beneath it all, there was something else. Something she couldn't name, but something real, something that tugged at her heart and refused to let go. She gently cupped his face in her hands, her fingers trembling as they traced the lines of his jaw, the softness of his skin. She knew what he needed to hear, but she didn't know if she had the strength to say it. What could she say to make him believe that everything they had fought for wasn't in vain, that their love wasn't just a fleeting moment in a world that seemed determined to crush them. "We can't fix everything, Julian," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "But we can fight. We can fight together. We've always fought, haven't we? Even when it felt impossible, even when the odds were against us. We've always fought, and we've made it this far." She paused, feeling the weight of her own words as they hung in the air between them. Her breath was shallow, and her chest ached with the truth of what she had just said. They had fought, and they had endured, but could they keep going? Could they keep fighting when it felt like everything was falling apart? Could love truly survive in a world that was so broken, so torn by hatred and fear? Julian's eyes searched hers, his expression unreadable, and for a long moment, they stood there, caught in a battle neither of them could escape. The wind howled around them, the distant sound of sirens still echoing in the streets, but in that silence, there was something else. Something deeper. She could feel the pulse of the world in his chest, the rhythm of his heartbeat against hers, and it reminded her of the first time they had met, back at the protests in college, when the world had seemed on fire and yet, in that moment, they had been so alive, so sure of the future they were fighting for. She had been so certain then, so full of hope, so convinced that love could tear down the walls that divided them. But now, as she looked into Julian's eyes, she wondered if that certainty had ever been real. Or was it just a dream? A wish that had been shattered by the harsh reality of the world they lived in. She wanted to tell him that everything would be okay, that they could rebuild what they had lost, but the words felt hollow, empty. The truth was, she didn't know what the future held. The country had chosen its path, and it wasn't a path that she could walk with ease. There would be no easy answers, no quick fixes. There would be no undoing the damage that had been done. But maybe that was the point, she realized. Maybe it wasn't about fixing everything, about making everything perfect. Maybe it was about holding on to what mattered, about fighting for what was right, even when the world seemed determined to tear it all apart. Maybe, just maybe, their love was a part of that fight. She drew in a shaky breath, her voice breaking through the silence. "I don't know what comes next," she whispered, her words barely audible against the howling wind. "But I know this, I'm not giving up on us. I'm not giving up on you, Julian. Not now. Not ever." Her heart pounded in her chest as she spoke, the weight of her words sinking in, and she felt something shift between them. Something subtle but undeniable. For a brief moment, she saw a flicker of hope in Julian's eyes, something that had been absent for so long. And in that instant, she realized that they weren't done yet. They still had a fight to fight. They still had a chance. Julian swallowed hard, his throat tight, but when he spoke, his voice was steadier than it had been all night. "I'm not giving up on you either," he said, his words low and fierce. "I don't care what the world thinks, what anyone thinks. We fought for this for us, and I'm not going to stop now. Not when it matters the most." He pulled her closer, his hands resting gently on her back as they stood there together, the weight of the world pressing down on them, but somehow it didn't feel as suffocating as it had before. Together, they had endured the worst of it, and somehow, together, they would find a way to endure whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but their love, though fragile, though tested, was not. And in that truth, they found something that no election result, no division, no hatred could ever take away. A reason to keep fighting. As the hours stretched into the quiet of the night, Lucia and Julian remained entwined, their bodies close, not just for warmth, but for something deeper, something more profound that neither of them fully understood but both felt as undeniable as the stars above them. The wind had slowed to a whisper, the once raging protests now little more than distant murmurs, their voices reduced to a faint, mournful hum that lingered in the air like the echo of something lost. The streets of Greenfield were almost deserted, the only sound the occasional creak of an old building settling into the stillness of the night, and the soft shuffle of their feet as they began to walk, still holding each other tightly, as if afraid the other might vanish in the quiet shadows. The city felt distant now, like a far-off dream, and in its absence, the two of them were left with nothing but their own thoughts, their own reflections on what had been, and what might never be. Lucia's mind swirled with images, her parents, her community, the faces of those who had fought for years against the tide of injustice, who had believed that one day the future would be different. But now, as she looked at Julian, the man she loved, she wondered if their belief in a better world had been naive, if it had been a fragile hope that had been ground under the weight of reality. The election had felt like a turning point, a moment when the course of everything they had fought for had shifted, a moment when everything they held dear seemed to be slipping out of reach. She had seen it in the faces of her neighbors, in the way they avoided her gaze after the results had been announced. The fear had been palpable, the anxiety settling in like a dark cloud over their small town. But there was something else now, too, something stirring in the pit of her stomach, a quiet defiance, a burning need to keep pushing forward, to hold on to what she believed, even if it felt like everything around her was falling apart. She felt Julian's hand tighten around hers, and for the first time that night, she looked up at him, really looked at him, seeing the raw emotion in his eyes. There was something in his gaze that made her chest tighten, an uncertainty, a longing, but also something else, something that felt like a promise. He had always been there for her, through the protests, through the moments when the world seemed determined to silence them, to make them small. But now, with the election results still fresh in their minds, she wasn't sure if he could truly understand the weight of the world she was carrying. His eyes, so full of sorrow, searched hers, as though he was waiting for some sign, some indication of what they were meant to do next. She could feel the question hanging in the air between them. How could they keep going when the world had chosen a path that they could never walk? How could they continue to love each other when the forces pulling them apart were so much stronger than their love could ever be? They kept walking, step by step, not toward anything, but away from everything, the noise, the pain, the crushing defeat that had settled over them like a blanket. The streets seemed different now, quieter, the shadows deeper, and in the distance, the faint light of a street lamp flickered like a beacon, a lone star in the vast expanse of darkness. Lucia felt the weight of everything, the oppression, the violence, the hatred that had always lingered just beneath the surface of her everyday life, bearing down on her. But there was something in the way Julian held her, in the way he moved beside her, that made her believe, just for a moment, that maybe it could be enough, that maybe love could still light the way, even through the darkest of times. She didn't know how they would survive this, how they would survive the political climate, the family divides, the constant pressure from every corner to choose sides. But she did know one thing, deep in her bones. They couldn't give up. Not now. Not when they had come this far. They passed through the streets, their steps slow and deliberate, as though the weight of the moment required them to move with care, to linger just a little longer in this fragile space between despair and hope. The soft murmur of the city was a quiet backdrop to their thoughts, the occasional flash of headlights from a distant car the only reminder that the world outside their small bubble was still moving, still turning. Lucia's thoughts turned to the future, what it would look like, what they could do to change things, what their role might be in this new reality they found themselves in. She had always believed in action, in the power of people coming together to create change. But now, with the new administration taking root, she wondered if their voices could still matter. She thought of her parents, who had worked tirelessly to provide for their family, to build a life in this country that had always promised so much but had given so little. They had been forced to fight for every inch of progress, and now, in the wake of the election, it felt as though all that struggle had been for nothing. She glanced up at Julian, feeling the distance that had grown between them. It wasn't that they didn't still love each other. No, that was still there, buried beneath the layers of doubt and fear. But the world around them had changed, and in many ways, they had changed too. The reality was inescapable. Their love was no longer a beautiful thing to be nurtured in secret. It had become a battleground, a symbol of everything that was wrong with a world that refused to see them as equals. "I don't know if we can keep doing this," Julian said suddenly, his voice heavy, as if the words had been waiting to escape for a long time. His eyes were distant, clouded with the weight of his own thoughts. I don't know how to fight anymore. It feels like everything is slipping through our fingers, like we're powerless in the face of all this hate. Lucia stopped walking, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to face him, her breath catching in her throat. His words struck her like a blow, and for a moment, she was unsure of how to respond. She had never seen him like this before, so vulnerable, so unsure. But there was something else in his voice, something that sounded almost like surrender. We can't stop fighting, she said, her voice firm, though it trembled slightly. Not now, Julian. We have to keep going, even if it's hard. Even if it feels like we're losing, we can't give up. If we give up now, what was it all for? What was the point of everything we fought for? She reached for his hand, pulling him closer, trying to steady him, trying to steady herself. We're not powerless. Not yet. As long as we still have each other, we still have the power to make a difference. We're still here, and that matters. Julian looked down at her, his eyes searching her face, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out between them like a vast chasm that neither knew how to cross. Then, slowly, he nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly as if some heavy weight had lifted, even if just a little. I don't want to lose you, Lucia, he said quietly. I don't want to lose us. The words were simple, but they held a depth of meaning that took Lucia's breath away. She looked up at him, and in that moment, the distance between them seemed to shrink, their hearts beating in sync, united in a way that the world around them could never understand. You won't lose me, she whispered, her hand gently cupping his cheek. Not as long as we fight together. They stood there, for a long time, their hands still entwined, the quiet of the night wrapping around them like a blanket. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges they couldn't predict, but in that moment, it didn't matter. They had each other, and that was enough. As the hours dragged on, the night's chill deepened, but neither Lucia nor Julian moved. They stood in the quiet street, their hands clasped together, their souls in a delicate dance of silence and shared understanding. The weight of the world pressed against their shoulders, and yet, in that stillness, they found something that had been absent for far too long, a sense of peace, a moment of quiet rebellion against the chaos that had consumed them. The world around them had fractured into 1,000 pieces, and the promises they had once held so dearly, of progress, of unity, of justice, seemed like distant echoes, fading with each passing day. The results of the election had felt like the final punctuation in a sentence that had been building for decades, a sentence that had only one message: there was no place for people like them. No place for their love, no place for the color of their skin, no place for the dreams they had dreamed of a better future. And yet, standing there in the cold, with the city sleeping around them, they found themselves at a crossroads, a place where the past and the future collided, where the choices they made now would determine who they would become, both as individuals and as a couple. Lucia's mind drifted, briefly, to the moment when she had first met Julian. How their worlds had collided in a whirlwind of shared passion for a better world, how they had spoken about revolution and change with such fervor, how they had believed, even in the darkest moments, that they could make a difference. But time had changed them. The weight of their daily lives, the constant pressure of being a couple in a world that didn't understand them, had worn away at the youthful optimism. The protests had become more frequent, the threats more real. Their love, once an act of defiance, had become their only refuge. But now, standing together in the night, their hearts entwined despite the world's attempts to pull them apart, Lucia realized that maybe they had been wrong. Maybe it wasn't the world they had to change first. Maybe it was them. It was a humbling thought, but it struck her like a lightning bolt. They had been so focused on fighting for a future that felt increasingly unattainable, so consumed by the external battle that they had neglected the one thing that had always kept them going: their love. If they could still hold on to that, if they could still fight for each other, with the same ferocity they once held for the cause, then perhaps they could find a way forward. "Do you remember?" Lucia whispered, her voice soft, breaking through the silence between them. "When we used to talk about running away, just leaving everything behind and starting over somewhere new, somewhere far from all of this." Julian's eyes flickered at the memory, and he gave a small, sad smile. "I remember," he said quietly. "We were so sure that we could just leave it all behind, that a new place would give us the freedom we wanted. And now?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. "What do you think now?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, and Lucia could feel the weight of his thoughts as they hung in the air between them. "I think," he said slowly, his voice breaking through the quiet like the soft crackle of firewood in a dying hearth, "that we were wrong about that. We were wrong to think that running away could solve anything." She turned to face him fully, her hands resting gently against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. "So what do we do now?" she asked, her voice small, almost uncertain. "We fight," Julian said, his voice firmer now, a quiet conviction filling the space between them. "We fight for each other, Lucia. For us. For our love. And for everyone who doesn't have a voice, for everyone who feels like they're not enough. We fight to make sure that they don't forget us. That we don't forget what really matters." The words hung in the air like a mantra, repeating themselves over and over in her mind, and in that moment, Lucia realized that she was no longer afraid. No longer afraid of the world's rejection, of the hatred that simmered beneath the surface. She was afraid, yes, but more than that, she was ready. Ready to face whatever came next with Julian by her side, ready to stand tall in a world that would try to tear them down, knowing that their love could not be so easily destroyed. In the distance, the faint sound of sirens echoed through the streets, the world outside their small bubble of existence still burning, still in turmoil. But the sound no longer felt like an omen of doom. It felt like a reminder that there was still work to do, a reminder that their love was the only thing that could survive, the only thing that could endure the darkness. They stood together, looking up at the sky, the stars shining down on them like ancient witnesses to a story that had been told 1,000 times before. Lovers torn apart by the world, but never truly defeated. "We'll never stop fighting, will we?" Lucia whispered, her eyes tracing the constellations above. "Never," Julian replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We won't stop. Not until our love is more than just a memory. Not until we've made the world see us, and see everyone who's ever been forgotten. We won't stop." And for the first time in a long time, Lucia believed him. She believed in him. She believed in them. They had been broken, yes. They had been tested in ways they hadn't thought possible. But they had survived. They had survived because they had each other. And that was something that the world could never take away. As they walked down the empty street, their hands intertwined, they knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be struggles. There would be pain. There would be moments when it felt like the world was too much to bear. But they also knew, with every fiber of their being, that they would never stop fighting. For their love, for each other, for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had ever dreamed of a better world. Because as long as they had each other, as long as they held on to that one truth, they knew they could change the world. Together.